IEP and You, a webinar hosted by the ARC and HUNE on Tuesday, March 22nd at 6:30. We have Lisbeth Little. Disclaimer, the ARC of Lehigh, Northampton County Advocacy Department does not employ lawyers nor provide legal advice. This training or any other provided by the ARC Advocacy Department does not constitute or imply the endorsement, recommendation, or favoring of the providing party or any employees or contractors acting on its behalf. This webinar is being provided for educational and informative purpose only. I would like to introduce our presenter, Lisbeth Little. She is a family advisor with HUNE. She conducts parent training sessions in both English and Spanish at HUNE. Ms. Little hosts Andy's Cafe, a bilingual parent support group. She also conducts trainings on special education for parents and professionals statewide and partners with parent support groups to empower parents to better advocate for their children's needs. Thank you, and the Zoom is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite. Thanks for having me. Muy buenas tardes. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Bueno, buenas noches. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Do want to advise you that the training will be bilingual in Spanish and English. I will do first the English translation, then the Spanish. Este taller, esta sesión va a ser en español y en inglés, va a ser bilingüe. Voy a empezar primero con el inglés y después con el español. Mi nombre es Lisbeth Little, trabajo por HUNE. Soy una de las consejeras de familia ahí. My name is Lisbeth Little. I work for HUNE. HUNE is an agency based out of Philadelphia, and we provide services and supports, advocacy, and trainings throughout the year, bilingually in a culturally sensitive manner. Para quienes no conocen, HUNE provee servicios de asesoría, de apoyo para las familias, también un grupo juvenil, y lo ofrecemos en una manera sensitiva a la cultura y también bilingüe. So today we're going to be talking about IEPs, the basics, what you need to know. Maybe for some of you, this is a refresher. For others, maybe this is brand new. The goal is to get you guys comfortable with the IEP and the document and the meetings and talking about the needs and having conversations with the team. It's also a lot of legalese, but hopefully the more you hear about it, the better you are to be more comfortable with it. Because when we talk about IEPs, automatically we feel a little bit hesitant, a little bit worried, a little bit concerned. Oh, what's it going to be about? What are we going to be talking about? So today's purpose is to get you guys comfortable, get you guys familiar, and maybe a little bit of a refresher. Hoy vamos a estar platicando sobre los planes educativos individualizados o el PEI. Para ustedes quienes ya son familiares con el plan, es quizás un repaso. Para otros que quizás son nuevos a esto, van a tener un mejor entendimiento de qué son y también un poco de familiaridad para que sean más, que tengan más confianza y que se sientan que tengan apoyo. Porque a veces uno va a estas reuniones y es un poco intimidante ir y se siente uno sin saber qué preguntar y qué decir. So before we start, I wanted to see if, and I think we have a few, what age brackets or where you identify, if you're a professional, if you're a parent of a young adult, if you're a parent of a child receiving early intervention. So I'm going to raise my hand because that would be me for one of my kids. Parent of a child with an IEP, also my other 3 kids. Parent of a 504, no 504 here. 14 to 21. Listen, I have one more year before I entered that magical age of transition planning. And if you are a parent of a teen, my heart goes out to you. I've got 3 soon-to-be teens, so I am feeling that pain. And a parent of a young adult, 22 to 26, or a professional. Padre de, no me recuerdo si, no lo puse en español. Ok. Un poco sobre ustedes para que yo sepa más o menos con quién estoy hablando. Ustedes se identifican como un padre de un niño que recibe intervención temprana de nacimiento a la edad de 5. Identifico yo porque tengo uno de 4. Padre de un niño con un IEP de edad escolar, o sea, digamos de la edad de 5 a los 21. Tengo los otros 3. Padre de un niño con 504. Padre con un niño de la edad de 14 a 21, aún me falta un año y si ustedes ya tienen niños de esa edad, pues lo vamos a pasar y sobrepasar y vamos a estar bien. Les digo que ahorita estamos en número con los míos. Es una edad muy más difícil de ser madre o padre, ¿no? Padre para un adulto joven de 22 a 26 o un profesional. All right, I'm going to start about the legal stuff because today we're not going to just chat about the IEPs, but we're going to chat about what is an IEP and how did it come about. So there's a couple other laws when we're talking about special education that we need to briefly cover. You're not going to become an expert on these, but it is a good opportunity to understand that there are other laws in play. Some services and supports will all be documented in either an IEP or a 504 if your child receives special education. But some things may be covered by ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if your child requires modifications or accommodations in the building they're in, after school, school activities, school trips, anything that is school sponsored, then ADA covers that child. And that would mean anything with the child having a physical disability, a mental disability, or they identify as having a disability, ADA would cover them. It also covers you out in public, out in the community. So when I worked in retail, I had to physically go around with a yardstick, which at the time was 36 inches wide. So I had to go through all the fixtures and all the aisles to make sure that it was at least 36 inches width apart so that people with disabilities would be able to have access to the aisles. Similarly, stores and businesses are required to have reasonable accommodations so that people with disabilities are able to participate in those businesses. It also covers museums, it covers anything in the community. Also covers parents. So if you as a parent have a disability and you need reasonable accommodations or modifications to attend a meeting or a school activity, the school needs to provide those. Section 504 is a civil rights law. It's fairly new, started in the 60s and 70s. And it started because people with disabilities wanted to be included in the community. And a lot of things at that time were not very inclusive. In some ways, things are the same. In other ways, we've come a long way. Section 504 also happens to be an education plan, but it also can do, you can have a 504 in a work environment. You can also use 504 if you're visiting a museum, other things in the community. It's not just educational. You're more familiar with it in an educational setting because sometimes kids that get special education services get them through a 504. And IDEA, which a lot of people don't know, but it started out by parents. And that's why we say that parents have the right to participate and are the leaders of the IEP meeting. They are equal members and they should participate. And that means that they should be involved and informed. IDEA started by a group of parents that said, hey, we want our kids to get together and have a play date. These groups of families from Pennsylvania, from both IDEA, and from that comes a lot of the principles that cover IEPs. It's important to know all these laws because sometimes when we're in school dealing with our kids' education, we have to do all three of these in order to get a plan that's appropriate for our child and that transitions to adulthood and out in the community. Lo voy a decir en español. Estas son mayormente las tres leyes que gobiernan los servicios de educación especial, pero también ambos gobiernan servicios en la comunidad. Por ejemplo, el acto para americanos con discapacidades afecta no solo a los niños, sino que también a los padres, los afecta tanto en la escuela como en la comunidad. Por ejemplo, si usted como madre o padre tiene una discapacidad o identifica como alguien, una persona con una discapacidad, la escuela debe de proveer servicios o modificaciones para que usted pueda atender actividades en la escuela, patrocinadas por la escuela, después de la escuela, y el distrito debe de hacer modificaciones para que usted pueda atender. Igualmente, cuando uno está en un plan de IEP o un plan de 504, si usted tiene ciertas discapacidades y requiere ciertos servicios, el distrito debe de proveer esos servicios para que usted tenga acceso a participar en esas juntas. El 504 es una ley civil y empezó en los 60s y 70s por la comunidad discapacidad que quería tener más inclusión y más participación en la comunidad. Afecta al trabajo, en el empleo, en las oficinas, afecta cuando uno va a la comunidad, los museos, acceso a diferentes negocios, diferentes aspectos de la comunidad. También afecta a la escuela. Algunos niños tienen un plan del 504 para proveer los servicios de educación especial y para modificar cómo los niños aprenden. También tienen a veces un 504 cuando ya están en el empleo y están en la comunidad como adultos. El plan de IDEA, por su acrónimo en inglés, es el acto de educación para individuos con discapacidades. Esto empezó en los 70s. Es la ley que da el derecho a nuestros niños con discapacidades a atender la escuela pública. Antes de esto, nuestros niños no podían atender la escuela y requerían ir a una escuela privada o permanecer en la casa y recibir su educación en la familia. Pero en los 70s, unos grupos de familias se juntaron para hacer reuniones con sus niños con discapacidades. Ustedes, como ya saben, que cuando nosotros los padres nos reunimos, empezamos a platicar y empezamos de ahí, pues empiezan las cosas, ¿no? Siempre yo digo que los padres tienen el poder porque nosotros, aunque somos pocos, cuando nos juntamos y se nos viene una idea, somos muy activos y muy... ¿cómo se llama? Participamos bastante para que nuestros hijos pues tengan los derechos y sean incluidos. Lo que pasó fue que demandaron al estado de Pensilvania y luego los llevaron al juicio. ¿Y qué les parece? Que las familias ganaron? De ese juicio empezó las leyes de IDEA, que es la ley que hace que nuestros niños tengan derecho a participar en la escuela y ser educados en la escuela en el ambiente menos restrictivo. Y de eso vamos a platicar un poquito más. Voy a pasar este video. I'm going to skip this video because it's in English, and in the interest of time, I want to get to the stuff that will be more useful to you guys. So this is the special education process. It starts with an evaluation. Then they do an evaluation and then determine if the child is eligible, IEPs or a 504. And then we talk about placement. Placement could be very individual to the child. It could be regular education with push in or pull out. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means. It could be special education or learning support. It could be various different locations. It could be a mixture of both. It doesn't mean that the child is necessarily in the whole day in that particular placement. And then instruction. What type of instruction? Who's going to instruct them? What program are they going to be using? How are they going to modify it? And then annually review it. That doesn't mean that you can't call an IEP at any time. In fact, you can call an IEP at any time. Make sure you have it in writing because you guys all know this is not Vegas. We need to make sure that we have proof that it actually happened. And we get that proof by documenting. The easiest way to document is email. And then a reevaluation, usually every 2 to 3 years, depending on the IEP category of the child. If the child, if we're talking about early intervention services, then that reevaluation happens more frequently. If we're talking school age, it's every 2 to 3. Sometimes they'll do a review of data, which means that they will not actually do a full reevaluation. So in the beginning, when they're doing the evaluation, they'll do an assessment of different things. They'll look at academic, cognitive, language, any therapies that they might need, related services. That could be occupational, physical, hearing and vision, anything in particular, like learning disabilities. They'll check all of that. And then they'll identify them. When they do a review of data, they'll look at data that they already have versus doing brand new assessments. Sometimes that's okay, but I always recommend to the families to always insist on a new reevaluation, because if it's every 3 years, if you originally evaluated them in kindergarten and you're waiving the every 3 year, think about when they're going to be assessed again. It's probably right before they go to middle school. That's a big gap in grades. It's also a big gap in progress. And so I always recommend that you not waive that and say, no, I want a full reevaluation. Never sign a document you don't understand, because a lot of times that's where the problems start. The parents signed something because they were told to sign, but they didn't read it, or they didn't understand it even after they read it. And the team is responsible for explaining what you're signing. If you don't understand it, don't sign it. Reach out to the ARC, your local chapter ARC. You can reach out any of the agencies listed in your procedural guidelines. They'll be happy to help you. Lo voy a decir en español. Este es el proceso de educación especial. Empezamos con una evaluación para determinar si son elegibles para los servicios de educación especial. Mientras hacemos el reporte y vemos si son elegibles, empezamos un PEI o un 504, dependiendo en los resultados de esa evaluación. Luego platicamos sobre el plazo, dónde vamos a poner al niño, en qué aula, en qué tipo de servicio, cuánto tiempo va a estar en ese tipo de aula, si va a ser en el aula donde hay apoyo para aprendizaje, lo vamos a poner en una clase solo de autismo, cuánto tiempo van a estar ahí, van a recibir servicios en el plazo regular, una aula regular, cuánto tiempo van a estar ahí, dónde van a requerir que reciban esos servicios, y la instrucción, cómo, cuándo y con quién, qué tipo de instrucción, qué tipo de programa, qué tipo de instrucciones vamos a necesitar, qué tipo de profesor lo va a proveer y a cuánto tiempo y cada cuándo. Después tenemos un reviso anual. Ese reviso tiene que ocurrir anualmente para hacer que la IEP tenga las metas renovadas, pero también usted puede pedir una reunión o una junta conforme usted necesita. Los hace por escrito, porque como siempre les digo que esta no es Las Vegas. Queremos que todos sepan lo que se platicó, la conversación que ocurrió, y un comprobante claro de que ustedes pidieron algo o tuvieron una conversación sobre algo. La manera más fácil de hacer eso es un correo electrónico. No es necesario que usted lo escriba en inglés, lo puede escribir en cualquier lenguaje que usted prefiere. Lo puede escribir incluso por papel y un crayón, pero la cosa es escribirlo, ¿no? Y mantener ese comprobante, una copia o un archivo. I wanted to switch back briefly to Spanish because when I was telling you guys about the IEP being annually reviewed, I mentioned that you could request an IEP at any time, an IEP meeting at any time. I forgot to mention that you don't necessarily have to say it in English. So if English is not your first language and your native language and your preferred language where you prefer to write with is a different language, write it in whatever your preferred language is. So for those that speak Spanish and prefer writing it in Spanish, make sure that you don't have to translate or find a translator to write it for you. You can write it in Spanish, send it in to them. And I was telling our Spanish speakers, doesn't matter if you email it or you write it, and if it's in crayon on craft paper, it doesn't matter as long as you keep a copy of it and you've properly informed the school that you want a meeting. The important thing is that you keep a copy of all of those conversations with the school so that we can track the timelines, which we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. Okay, estábamos por el reviso anual y después cada 2 o 3 años para niños de edad escolar hacemos una reevaluación. Para niños que están recibiendo intervención temprana, esa reevaluación ocurre más seguido. Por lo mínimo cada año, pero a veces hacen un reviso del plan cada 3 meses, porque para esa edad pues los niños están progresando mucho más fácil o más rápido que a un niño que ya está de edad escolar. La reevaluación a veces le dicen, pues queremos reevaluar usando la información o data que ya tenemos. No hay necesidad de hacer nuevas pruebas, nuevos exámenes, porque solo vamos a usar la información que ya tenemos. Yo siempre le digo a las familias que no acepten eso y que no firmen eso, que no estén de acuerdo, que hagan una reevaluación completa en todas las áreas, académico, cognitivo, cómo están leyendo, cómo están aprendiendo, cómo inscriben terapias relacionadas que pueden ser de terapia física, terapia ocupacional de motoras finas, sensorial, todo eso se debe reevaluar. Y pues, excepto bajo ciertas condiciones, siempre es mejor que hagan una reevaluación completa, o sea, que hagan nuevas pruebas, que hagan nuevos exámenes. Porque si nos ponemos a pensar, si evalúan cuando está en kinder, o sea, cuando tiene 5 años, está empezando el sistema escolar. Y la próxima vez que hacen una reevaluación, solo usan la data que ya tienen, la información que habían colectado. Entonces es posible que este niño no sea reevaluado por las metas o pruebas académicas hasta, digamos, 5º grado o 4º grado. Y ese es un tiempo bastante donde se puede progresar, bastante cambio se espera. Entonces, para mí es una buena idea de que no acepten que solo hagan un reviso. So I was talking about timelines, and here it is. Evaluations are 60 calendar days from when parent signs the permission to evaluate form, or when they verbally say, hey, I want to, I want my child evaluated. The school district has then 10 days to come back with a form and say, oh, we need to sign this, or they'll say, okay, we're going to accept your verbal. In most cases, they'll come back to you, give you a form. That form should say that it's permission to evaluate. That is only giving the school district permission to evaluate. It is not giving them permission to start services. It is purely just to evaluate, to see if they qualify for services. It's also not a form that says, oh yes, your child's getting services. It's to see if they qualify. Reevaluation every 2 years with parent request and or permission. You can actually ask for a reevaluation annually. And that will be at school district expense. Sometimes that's valuable, sometimes that's not. If something changes, so let's say the child plays sports, was receiving special education services, and then they got a concussion, or they got a TBI from an accident, a traumatic brain injury from an accident, or something happened, they had a new health issue, or something happened that changed how the student learns or affects how the student learns. That should be a time where the school district and you come together and say, let's do a reevaluation. It's also very important for kids that have seizures, that have a medical condition that's causing them, or that for whatever reason they are having seizures. It's important to look at new data to see if how they are learning is affected, especially their memory and how the process of how they learn or acquire new information. Because unless we have a true baseline of how those kids are learning, we're probably most likely not going to get an accurate view of what services they need. Implementation of an IEP, 14 days after a parent signs and accepts an IEP. So at this point, you've had an evaluation, they've given you the evaluation report, you've had an evaluation report meeting, you've reviewed everything, and now you've had an IEP meeting, and you've discussed everything, all your concerns, and now they are going to, you agreed to everything, they agreed to everything, you reached an agreement, and you have a IEP draft. Then you sign and say, yes, I accept that he or she receives early in the, I'm sorry, I keep saying early intervention. He or she accepts special education services. As I will outline in the IEP, you sign, you keep a copy. They give you a copy of your procedural rights, which you probably throw on your bedside table and plan not to read unless you need them. My suggestion is that you actually read them, because I know it's very tedious, but it has useful information as to what to do when you disagree. Chances are, if you have a child with an IEP or a 504, at one point in time, you're going to disagree. Disagreements happen. It's not a guarantee that you're always going to agree to what is being provided, but you'll be in a better place if you actually read those procedural guidelines so that you don't miss a timeline. So they have 14 days from the time that you sign and agree for them to actually start services. So if the IEP says, oh, he's going to get OT 2 or 3 times a week, they have 14 days to start that. That's when the timeline starts. If for whatever reason they never provide that service, it goes from that date and time that you signed and sent that back. Eligibility, 25% delay in areas of global functioning. And this is slightly different for children that are early intervention, because for school age, it's one of the 13 categories, the disability categories, and need special designed instruction. So it's not just enough that they have a disability, but also that it impacts how they learn. And then transition, usually within 1 year of a child being eligible for kindergarten. And that is usually something as informal as a phone call, a Zoom meeting, or getting together to write in the plan. Yes, we talked about transition. We inform parent of what they need to do to transition and what the plan is. And so it's something in the back of the child's preschool IEP that says, yeah, we're, kid's going to start kindergarten. It's as simple as that, or it could be more involved as outlining what exactly the parent should expect. If you don't know what your transition plan is, and you have a child that's starting kindergarten, let's say this September, and hopefully that's not the case, but if it is, reach out to your case manager and find out what the steps are, because by this point for a child that's entering kindergarten, there should have been a transition meeting. School District Philadelphia is slightly different because there's this two-step process for registration, but most school districts are already scheduling their open houses. Most are in the process of starting their registration, usually in April or May. So reach out to your case manager and reach out to your local IU to get more information. If we're talking school age, the timelines you can see from the chart are slightly different. For reevaluation, it's every 3 years unless the child has an intellectual disability, and that's every 2 years. And then for implementation of the IEP, it's 10 days from the time you all agree to, yes, this is what we're getting, this is how we're doing it, this is when we're doing it, this is who and what, when and why, and we agree to the IEP, then that's 10 days. And the category, it's 1 of 13. And at age 14, it's that magic number when you start thinking about high school and after high school. Certainly not the time when you start doing transition, but it's legally the age where we're required to sit down and do a transition plan in the IEP for the child. So that was a lot of talking in English. Now I'm going to do a lot of talking in Spanish. These are very helpful to know, because I can't tell you how many times I get phone calls from parents and they're past these deadlines, or the deadlines have come and gone and the parent is still waiting for something. And these deadlines are federally mandated. So the district has to abide by them. The IU has to abide by them. And you don't want to miss a deadline because you forgot to sign something, or you weren't sure what you were signing, so you didn't sign it and did nothing. These are timelines, and there is a responsibility on who is providing the services, but there's also a responsibility on the parent to understand what you need to do. Estas son los líneas de tiempo que lo llamamos en inglés. Son las fechas y los datos que uno tiene que tener en la mente cuando está platicando sobre servicios de educación especial. Son muy importantes porque a veces recibimos llamadas de familias que necesitan ayuda y no saben que tenían 60 días de calendario a partir del momento que usted firmó el permiso para que el distrito termine la evaluación. Esto es para niños de intervención temprana, niños de edad escolar. Firmar ese papel, esa aplicación, solo da permiso para que el distrito o el IU evalúe a su niño para ver si ellos son elegibles para recibir educación especial. No quiere decir de que van a recibir los servicios ni que van a empezar, sino solo quiere decir que los van a evaluar. Ya que son elegibles y tienen un plan, lo revisan o cada 2 o cada 3 años. Para edad escolar es cada 3 años, excepto si el niño tiene una discapacidad intelectual, y entonces son cada 2 años. Llegaron de acuerdo, hicieron la evaluación, hicieron la junta para el reporte de la evaluación, ya tuvieron la reunión para el IEP, hablaron sobre el IEP, todo está de acuerdo, no hay nada que preguntar, ya todos estamos claros qué servicios, quién, cómo y cuándo, y está en el plan. Usted firmó aceptando el plan, y entonces el distrito o el IU tiene 14 días para empezar esos servicios si el niño está en preschool o menor de 5 años, y tiene 10 días si es que el niño está en el distrito escolar, o sea, de kindergarten a los 21. Elegibilidad. Para ser elegible para los servicios, tiene que tener un 25% de retraso en una área funcional o tener una discapacidad. Para edad escolar, no es simplemente necesario tener una discapacidad, sino que también es necesario que esa discapacidad afecte al niño en cómo está aprendiendo, o sea, afecte en el área de educación. Transición es 1 año antes de que empiece en kinder, y si está usted en esa etapa donde el niño va a empezar en kinder este septiembre y no han platicado sobre transición, póngase en contacto con la persona de intervención temprana porque ya deben de tener una transición, ya habrán tenido una plática, a veces es por teléfono, a veces por computadora, a veces es simplemente decirle, bueno, vamos a empezar la transición y es solo algo muy corto en el IEP que dice que van a tener una transición. En otras veces es un plan. Ok, la próxima persona que va a platicar con usted va a ser esta persona. Luego a esta fecha, cuando lo tiene que llevar al distrito para registrar. En el distrito de Filadelfia es un proceso de 2 etapas y para este tiempo ya casi todos los distritos ya tienen las fechas para los open house que hacen para que ustedes vayan a visitar el kindergarten y conozcan cómo va a ser el proceso, y también ya deben estar en la etapa donde ya han firmado el permiso para reevaluar y el permiso de intención a registrar para kinder, en Filadelfia en particular. Si usted no sabe si ya firmó la transición o no está clara en el plan de transición para un niño que entra a kinder, pónganse por favor en comunicación con alguien de su servicio de intervención temprana. Ahora, la transición escolar empieza legalmente a los 14, es cuando tienen que tener una reunión y empezar un plan. Para qué pasa después de high school, qué pasa en la high school y qué pasa a los 18 o a los 21. All right. So this is a chart that tells you about students with disabilities. Remember, we were talking about the disability categories. These are the categories. So sometimes it might say OHI, so other health impairment, and it might include kids that don't fit any of the other categories. So I'll give you an example. OHI could be anxiety. OHI could be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, numerous different things. If it's a learning disability, so maybe it's dysgraphia, dyslexia. Dyslexia is the more common one that's mostly known. These are all types of learning disabilities. Depending on your district, they might not say dysgraphia. They might not say dyslexia. What they will say is learning disability or specific learning disability or specific learning disorder. And that's because the IEP category is labeled as that. Some districts use specifically dyslexia, others not. The point is that it's accurately labeled as a IEP category that gets them services. And then in the IEP, that it outlines exactly what services that child needs. So I wouldn't get too caught up in the language. In certain cases, we as advocates do, but as long as it's a disability that gets them an IEP and gets that documentation, we can usually work on the need based on that as well. It's also not just to one specific category. You can see numerous categories on the IEP. Some districts like only to list the top 2 or 3. Other districts will list all of them. It really isn't, what's better, what's not. It's what gets the child the services they need based on the need identified in the evaluation report. And it is possible for a child to have a medical disability, and I'll give you an example. So the child has medically a diagnosis of autism, but on their IEP, autism is not one of the disability categories listed. Maybe they'll have emotional disturbance as listing, or they'll have a specific learning disability as a listing, but not autism. And so the family's like, oh, well, the child has autism, why isn't it listed? That's because based on the evaluation report, the child's need identified with a student with an IEP disability of whatever's listed on the IEP. There's a difference between a medical disability and an educational disability. For an educational disability, we're not looking at the medical diagnosis. We're looking at what is the educational need to help this child learn. And that can be a little bit confusing, but I'm explaining why that might not be listed. Okay, estos son para niños con discapacidades, las categorías del IEP, donde son elegibles para servicios. Puede ser autismo, puede ser sordera, puede ser discapacidad de aprendizaje. Cuando dice discapacidad de aprendizaje, puede ser una lista de un montón de problemas de aprendizaje. La más conocida es dislexia o discalculia o disgrafia. Todos ellos son problemas de aprendizaje, y en el IEP no va a decir dislexia. En la mayoría de los distritos va a decir discapacidad de aprendizaje específico. También otro que se usa es otros problemas de salud. A veces esto incluye niños que tienen ansiedad o niños que tienen deficiencia en atención y hiperactividad. Puede ser varias diferentes categorías que están incluidas en otro problema de salud. A veces hay un ejemplo, hay niños que tienen el diagnóstico médico de autismo, pero que no tienen la categoría de IEP de eso, sino que tienen quizás perturbación emocional o problemas de salud o discapacidad de aprendizaje, cualquier otra cosa en que se muestra una necesidad. La razón por esta es que la escuela no diagnostica. La escuela simplemente evalúa para ver si estos niños necesitan educación especial, o sea, servicios especiales que no están aprendiendo como los demás niños y requieren ciertos programas de educación que el profesor regular no puede dar. O sea, cómo aprenden estos niños es un poco más, no es común y se requiere ciertos programas, ciertas modificaciones, ciertas acomodaciones y que para eso se requiere un plan. No quiere decir que el niño médicamente no tiene el diagnóstico que tiene, simplemente quiere decir que para proveerle servicios en la escuela, estos niños tienen necesidades que se mejor identifican bajo otra categoría. A veces el niño tiene dislexia y no dice dislexia, sino que dice aprendizaje específico. Por la razón por la cual es que como este es un plan federal, tiene ciertas categorías que tienen que ser identificados los niños para recibir esos servicios. En algunos distritos sí dicen dislexia y se sabe que están bajo esa categoría. En otros distritos no. Por lo general, en Pensilvania, los distritos lo identifican como está aquí en esta imagen. También lo que quería decir es que es posible que niños tengan varias categorías de la IEP. A veces los distritos ponen 1, 2 o 3, otros solo 1. Y a veces los padres dicen, pero ¿por qué no dice autismo si mi niño tiene autismo? Pues quizás la categoría donde ellos reciben los servicios es otra de estas categorías. Realmente no importa tanto la etiqueta de qué categoría usan, sino que más que identifiquen las necesidades actuales basadas en la evaluación. O sea, que hagan la evaluación y que la evaluación sea clara y que la evaluación tenga todas las áreas identificadas de qué necesita el niño para aprender. Eso es más útil que cuántas categorías pongan, porque el plan se basa sobre las necesidades que están en el reporte de evaluación. So I'm going to say this in English because I don't think I said it. It's more important that the evaluation report correctly identify need because that's what the IEP is based on. So areas of evaluations, we covered this a little bit. So I'm just going to put this up there for you guys to see, but this does not include all. It includes the ones that you more typically see, but it does not include all the evaluations. There or areas of evaluation, I should say. Estas son las áreas de evaluaciones donde el distrito identifica si el niño requiere un plan para educación especial. No son todas las áreas y no son de evaluación, pero son las áreas que mayormente miramos. Cognitivo, académico, conducta. And at any time, if there is a new need, like I mentioned, a child that had a sports injury and required a new evaluation, they could do a whole evaluation or they could do just certain areas. So for example, if a child has a new medical condition that is affecting how they're learning, then you can just say, oh, I'd like an OT evaluation, or I'd like a vision evaluation, or maybe I'd like an academic because or a cognitive because I want to know how their memory is affected, that type of thing. Or I want an evaluation for assistive technology. You could just limit it to a specific area of evaluation or a whole new evaluation. Now, if we're talking about reevaluation, I suggest you do a full, whatever area, and not limit it. Estas son las áreas de evaluaciones. Usted puede pedir que hagan solo ciertas evaluaciones, digamos, tecnología de asistencia. Quizás es un niño que requiere asistencia técnica o requiere terapia de visión. Usted no sabe cómo impacta su visión el aprendizaje. O quizás usted quiere saber cómo está aprendiendo y usando la memoria, cómo afecta cómo está aprendiendo, al nivel que está aprendiendo. Entonces, quizás solo una evaluación cognitiva. Pero por lo general, cuando estamos hablando de una reevaluación, yo siempre aviso que hagan una reevaluación en todas estas áreas. So the IEP team, I've mentioned it, and I'm going to say it again because I think it's really important. You, the parent, are an equal member of the IEP. You, the parent, can run this meeting. You send an email with all your concerns. This is what I want to talk about at the IEP. You don't know what you want to talk about, but you have questions. These are my questions. This is what I don't understand. This is what I want to understand. This is what I want you guys to explain to me. You can bring somebody else. In fact, I recommend you bring somebody else because it's impossible to remember everything that goes on in that meeting. It's very intimidating. There's probably, a lot of members of the team. You can look at this page, look at everyone that's going to be there, and then there's you. Take somebody with you. That person can be your note taker. That person can be your, hey, remember you told me you wanted this. Take another parent that's gone through this. Take somebody that you trust. If you have an outside medical team, ABA or developmental pediatrician or any staff that handles the medical or through your medical, take them with you. If you have a behavior team that's through your medical insurance, take somebody from that team to the meeting so that they can talk about what they see during the school day too. If you have another language that you speak and English is not your native language, or you speak English, but you would prefer having an interpreter there just in case, you have a right to that, and you should have an interpreter there. If you have a disability and you require certain modifications or accommodations, you should let them know ahead of time because they have a right to provide that. And typically, these are the other people that you will see. It's always a good idea at the beginning of the meeting to insist that they go around the room and explain to you who's who, because sometimes there's somebody there that you have no clue who they are. And I don't know about you, but I like to know who's in the room. So I always insist that they go around the room. And I also insist that they don't call me mom or dad because I have a name. I hate being called mom or dad. That kind of takes the person away. And I want them to know, hey, I'm a person and I'm representing my child. Sometimes the student is there, and I recommend if your student is able to be present in however way they are able. So I have a son that is not very shy, but he just doesn't like people. He doesn't like meetings and he doesn't like to waste his time. He's very impatient. So we have slowly introduced him to participating in IEPs by drawing stuff that let us know what he liked or didn't like. I've recorded him, I've done speech to text. We are now at a point where he writes me a paragraph of likes and dislikes, what's working, what's not working, and what he would like more of and what he would like changed. But however way that they would like to be present, it's always a good idea. And also when he was younger, I would send in a sheet that was called All About You. If you do a Google search, you'll find examples of it. And so it would have his picture, and it would have how he learns, what he doesn't like, sensory needs, and what he's good at and what he's still working on. It was just something short, sweet, and I would give it to everyone in the team, and we would then use that for substitute teachers. It was helpful to keep my son present so that they would know that we were discussing a child or a student, because sometimes it's probably just the way that they are trying to do their job. But I think sometimes they lose track of the fact that we're providing services for a child. And I think it's important to remind the team that we're talking about a child, a young adult, a teenager, and that they want to learn. And that not only do they want to learn, but they have the federally legal right to learn. And so I think it's a good reminder to them. Yo siempre les digo que los padres son los más importantes, los padres son capaces de hacer la reunión o la junta y de decidir qué vamos a platicar en esa junta. Es importante que ustedes digan, estas son mis preguntas, esto es lo que yo quiero hablar, esto es lo que quiero claro, para esto nos vamos a reunir, para hacer una agenda de cómo va a ser esta reunión. Siempre es una buena idea al principio de la reunión de saber el equipo, de quién está presente, porque a mí a veces voy a una reunión y yo no sé quién es una persona y yo quiero saber, van a estar platicando de mi hijo, pues yo quiero saber quién está en la mesa o en el Zoom. También invite a alguien que vaya con usted, porque en estas reuniones pues hay tanta gente y a uno es imposible que se le olvide, que se recuerde todas las cosas, especialmente en mi mente, yo no me recuerdo las cosas, entonces lleve a otra persona. Yo me recuerdo yendo a estas reuniones, iba sola a veces, y es mejor ir acompañado porque uno se siente un poco mejor, ¿no? También si usted sabe a alguien que sabe su hijo, digamos alguien de servicios que reciben por su seguro médico, y usted quiere que estén ahí, invítelos. Un pediatra de desarrollo, un especialista, uno del equipo de conducta, invítelos para que vayan a la reunión. También, si usted no domina bien el inglés o si usted se siente mejor sabiendo que hay un intérprete ahí, pídalo. Si necesita modificaciones porque usted se identifica con una discapacidad, pida esas acomodidades antes de la reunión para darle tiempo al equipo. Y también incluye a su estudiante. No importa qué edad tengan, hay manera de incluirlos. Le estaba contando en inglés que cuando mi niño estaba chiquito, él me dibujaba cosas de qué le gustaba, qué no le gustaba, o me decía. Ahora que ya está grande, pues él ya me lo escribe. Me escribe lo que le gusta, lo que no le gusta, lo que está funcionando, lo que necesita para que funcione y lo que quiere. A veces es posible, a veces no, pero es una buena idea de recordarle al equipo de que todo esto es, el propósito de todo esto es para que nuestro hijo aprenda. También cuando estaba chiquito yo usaba una página con su foto y las cosas que estaba aprendiendo, las cosas que necesitaba que aprender, lo que le gustaba y lo que no le gustaba. Y se lo ponía ahí en la junta y lo usábamos cuando habían profesores de sustituto y también cuando había un nuevo miembro del equipo. Pero era una manera de recordarles de que el propósito de todo esto es para que mi hijo reciba la educación que legalmente le pertenece, ¿no? So, what time is it? Okay. So, when we're looking at an IEP, we're looking at all the pages in the back. So the first couple pages are all the biographic, all the demographics, the contact information, name of the child, you know, when the last evaluation was, blah, blah, blah. But then we get to the page where it says present levels of performance. This is where it says last grades, last report card, what they're learning now, what their baselines are. What I mean by that is if their goal is in 3 out of 4 times, the child will accurately, raise their hand before they respond. It should say, this is, if it's not a new goal, it should say on this goal, the present level of this goal is, maybe they're at, 60% of that goal. Maybe they're sometimes raising their hand, but they're not doing it at, the goal of 3 out of 4. Maybe they're sometimes raising their hand, but they're still blurting it out. So they're not waiting. So it should say there on present levels of performance. Maybe the IEP says that the child's going to be at a reading level of 3rd grade using a particular program. And the child is, the last testing they did or last assessment, he was maybe reading at a grade level 2.5 or year-end 2nd. So it should say there where they're at now. And now means whenever you're meeting. So if you met in December and you're meeting now again in the spring, those present levels of performance should be updated for the spring, usually between 1 and 2 weeks of the actual IEP. Those levels should always be updated. It should never have outdated information. The annual goals should also always be updated to what we're working on this school year. It should not be just last year they were in 3rd grade and this year they're in 4th grade and we went and fixed the grade number to say 4th because that's what grade they're in. We should be looking at the goals, seeing if they were met, why they weren't met, and what is needed. And you don't need to know the answers to this, but you should start that conversation of let's look at the present levels. Let's look at the goals. Can you explain the goals? Can you explain why they're written this way? And can you explain how often we're going to review them? How often the teachers are reviewing? We don't expect you to be experts in any of this, but you do have the right, and I feel that as parents, we have the obligation of asking questions because questioning is how we learn. And it's not a matter of being rude or, questioning or doubting the teachers. It's a matter of, we have a document here that is documenting what support our child needs in order to learn. And you are within your rights to ask, well, what is this? And what does it mean? And how often are we tracking it? And when it comes to instruction, what instruction are they providing? If we said that he had learning disability in reading and writing, and that he required a multisensory specific explicit program, well, what does that mean? And what program are you using? And is that program appropriate for a child with this learning disability? And can you show me where, maybe on the website for this program or on whatever textbook, it says that this is appropriate for this type of disability? because sometimes the districts are using a curriculum that they have bought for all the kids, and it might not be appropriate for a child with that learning disability. And not many parents think to ask that because we're just, we're overwhelmed. We're learning a lot of information. We're sitting down. It's a lot of information dump, but it's important that you ask, who is doing this instruction? Is this instruction appropriate for my child, for the needs of my child? Can you show me where in this program it says that? And then, okay, how often are we going to track progress? How are we going to know that this plan is working? How often are we going to meet to see if this plan is working? At a minimum, you should be getting progress reports every time you have a report card. So every time there's a report card conference, you should also get a progress report. And that progress report should say, this is the present levels, this is the goal, this is where we're at, this is what's being done, this is what we're seeing, this is what areas they're still working on. And that should be more than just, here's the paper, sign it. It should be a communication. It should be, it's not as formal as an IEP meeting, but it is pretty formal where you sit down with maybe the special education teacher and the regular ed teacher, and you have a right to ask questions. And it's not something where, you're quizzing them. It's more, let's have a conversation. Let's talk about how my child is learning. None of the things that are written on that progress report should be a surprise. If it is a surprise, if the report card's a surprise, there's a communication problem. And then maybe you need to have a meeting, a separate meeting for an IEP meeting to discuss how often you should communicate with progress or when there's a problem, because nothing should ever be a surprise. You should be informed along the way. Can I say this in Spanish? Estamos hablando del área del IEP, donde después de que uno se mira el número de teléfono, la dirección, qué escuela va, identificación de la familia, de los padres y del niño, estamos hablando de cuando estamos hablando de lo mero del plan, los niveles actuales de rendimiento, cómo está aprendiendo ahorita, a cómo va el niño, a qué nivel está, también las metas anuales, qué metas tienen, en qué estamos trabajando para todos estos planes, para ver progreso en qué tipo de metas tenemos. Y esas metas deben de cambiar según la necesidad del niño. No solo vamos a cambiar, digamos, va a aprender a nivel de grado cuarto y ahora empezó el quinto y vamos a cambiar la misma meta, pero vamos a cambiarlo al quinto. No, vamos a tener una conversación de qué ha aprendido el niño, a qué nivel va, ha habido progreso y si no cumplió la meta, el por qué. ¿Qué fue lo que no funcionó? Tenemos que tener una plática abierta de ¿funciona este plan o no funciona? Y si no funciona, ¿qué fue lo que nos falló? ¿En qué fallamos? ¿Y cómo lo arreglamos? La instrucción. ¿Quién está dando la instrucción? Si me dijeron que iban a hacer un programa, un currículo adaptivo, ¿cómo se llama ese currículo? Yo tengo el derecho a revisarlo. Comprueben de que ese currículo va con la necesidad de mi niño. Si me dicen que mi niño tiene un problema de aprendizaje específico, esa instrucción que van a usar, este programa, este libro que van a usar, es aceptable para niños con esa discapacidad. Porque lo que pasa es que los distritos compran estos programas y los compran como para 2, 3 años, 5 años a veces. Y algunos de esos programas no son especializados para niños con problemas de aprendizaje o para niños que requieren educación especial. Entonces, es siempre una recomendación de preguntarle a estos distritos, compruebe, enséñeme dónde dice que esta instrucción es específico para niños con las necesidades de mi hijo. Porque así es como uno aprende y así es cuando también a veces el distrito aprende, el personal aprende de que quizás el programa no es adecuado, quizás por eso no hay progreso en las metas. O a veces las metas, es posible que el niño ya va a cumplir la meta, pero no el completo. Digamos, la meta dice en 3 de 4 veces el niño no va a decir la respuesta, sino que primero va a levantar la mano, va a esperar que la profesora lo llame y ahí luego va a dar su respuesta. Quizás el niño ya levanta la mano, pero todavía no se puede controlar el impulso y rápido dice la respuesta. Entonces, hay que ver dónde van las metas, ¿verdad? El nivel actual de rendimiento, dónde va el niño, cómo va. Y el progreso de cómo va debe de ser esa comunicación por lo menos cada vez que hay las calificaciones. Cada vez que usted se reúne para las calificaciones, debe de ver un reporte de progreso. Y nada de que se dice en ese reporte de progreso o en las calificaciones debe de ser sorpresa. Si es sorpresa, o bueno o malo, eso quiere decir que hay un problema en la comunicación y para eso usted hace una carta y pide una junta especial para la IEP y en eso pueden platicar la comunicación. Pero esas conferencias para las calificaciones y el progreso deben de ser aparte de una reunión de la IEP. Y esas reuniones pueden ser con el profesor de aula regular y el profesor de educación especial. Y a veces es simplemente una conversación, otras veces es nos sentamos y tenemos una reunión. Depende en lo formal, pero por lo menos deben de revisar ese reporte. All right, so related services are in the back of the IEP, and they are sometimes the what. So the first part, the present levels of performance are, okay, this is what we're going to track, and this is how it's going to be provided, and this is how they'll be learning in their educational classroom. The related services are things that they need in order to have that education or to be ready to learn. It could also be related services that they need in order to learn. Example of that might be occupational therapy. They're receiving occupational therapy for their sensory needs. They're getting occupational therapy for their fine motor needs. And they're getting physical therapy for their physical ability to be able to independently walk in the building or to be able to go from one room to another. Maybe they use a wheelchair and require multiple medical. And so they are getting nursing to help them with that, or they have access to the nurse's suite because they require medication in school. So there's different reasons why they require related services, but that should be listed in the IEP, and it should say who, what, and when. And by who, I don't mean the name of the person. It will say the function of the person. So it might be the nurse's suite, it might be the nurse staff, it might be a trained medical, and it will say, you know, trained nurse of what they're trained to do. And for therapies, you know, how often, when and where, what they're getting, interpreting services. And that means, you know, if a child needs interpreting services, how often they're getting it. Counseling, transportation is typically door to door, and it lists how often they're getting it, if they're just getting it in the morning and the afternoon, if they're getting it full time, and also any other type of services that the child requires in order to learn. That's where you'll see all of the therapies typically, and any other non-direct educational. What I mean by that is no specific programming, no curriculum, but more the services that they need in order to get through their day. So son los servicios relacionados. Los servicios relacionados son esos servicios que se requieren para que el niño aprenda. No son la programación ni el currículo, sino que es servicios que el niño requiere para estar físicamente aprendiendo. Puede ser terapia ocupacional, terapia física, puede ser terapias de visión, de psicólogo, quizás necesita una enfermera o uso de la enfermería porque requiere medicamento durante el día. También transporte de puerta a puerta o cómo él sea independiente en la escuela, en la aula, o sea, cambia de aula si requiere ayuda, cómo va a caminar o usar, si usa silla de ruedas o diferentes accesibilidades, cómo es que va a accesar los diferentes aulas. We're going to backtrack a little bit to the goals because if the goal has not been met and it's a goal that you've had for 2 or 3 years and all you've done is change the grade, then maybe we need to go back and look at this goal and see how it's being, what's tracking, is it still appropriate? Was it written in a way where maybe they're not getting the correct data? Because remember, the people that are working with your child as a child is learning in school, they're supposed to be recording how they're learning. And so the goal should be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant to the needs of the child, and timely. If it's been the same goal for 3 or 4 years and it's never been met, that's a problem. Maybe you need to go back and do a reevaluation. Maybe you need to reword the goal. Maybe you need to look at how the data is being tracked. Whatever the reason is, there's a problem with that goal and it should be fixed. typically. Now, if it's, academic, so it's reading and writing, and you have seen progress, and okay, it's the same goal, but it's being tracked different, and it's been changed in the specific design instruction in it of the how and why is being changed. Maybe that goal is okay if you're seeing progress. What I'm talking about is goals that you've had and the child has never reached, or will never reach, or the goal, there's no point to it or behind it anymore. There was maybe at one time, but now there isn't. Some of those goals might need to be changed or taken out if they've already been met. So you need to look at the goals and your present levels and make sure that they still make sense given the need that was shown in the evaluation report. If you're not sure, go and review the goals and ask them in the meeting. Let's review the goals. You could call a meeting for any reason. You can call a meeting and say, I want you to walk me through every single page of this IEP and explain to me the purpose, because that's what you need. And that's completely fine. I wouldn't suggest that because you're going to be there for a long time. And given the time constraints, you're going to be there often. But I would suggest, hey, can we have a meeting? Because I want to talk about goals. Can you explain to me, how these are specific? How are they SMART goals? How are they still needed goals? That's a conversation you can have with the team. Quería hablar un poco sobre las metas, de que las metas deben ser específicos, medibles, alcanzables, pertinentes a la necesidad del niño y basadas en el tiempo de que estamos platicando. Digamos, si estas metas, la misma meta de año a año y nunca es alcanzable, nunca han cumplido con esa meta, eso es que hay algo ahí, ¿verdad? Hay un problema con esta meta. O la meta ha cambiado, pero usted no ha visto mucho progreso. Indica que hay un problema también. Si la meta no es específico o que no ayuda, usted piensa que no ayuda en cualquier cosa en lo que su niño necesita, basado en la evaluación, entonces es tiempo para tener una plática, una reunión, una junta de la IEP y decir, quiero platicar sobre las metas. Yo quiero platicar sobre el por qué tenemos estas metas y cómo son medibles, cómo son alcanzables, cómo son pertinentes a la necesidad de mi hijo. ¿Por qué es que tenemos estas metas? Y tener una plática sobre eso, de qué son las metas, por qué lo tienen, la razón por qué data están captando con esta meta, para que ustedes tengan un entendimiento de por qué está esta meta y dónde hay el progreso, porque a veces no se entiende el por qué sin tener esta plática. Instruction is the content, the what will be learned, and what times they're going to be teaching it. So if the instruction is meant to get them up to grade level, but you're pulling them from when, let's say it's a learning ELA, let's say it's English language arts, and they're pulling that child from English language arts when that's being taught in the classroom. And maybe the child just needs a little bit more support in it. Maybe it makes more sense to have the delivery at a different time. Or maybe the child is not at grade level and the class is doing English language arts and they're not pulling them during English language arts. And he's not at third grade level, but he's staying there for the third grade lesson and you're having a lot of behaviors during that lesson. Well, of course you are, because he's not at that grade level. How do we support that child? Maybe we can have the delivery at that time. Maybe it's in the same classroom, maybe it's outside of the classroom. So the specially designed instruction is the content, what's going to be learned. What curriculum are we using? When will they learn it? How are they learning it? And who is going to teach it to them and when? It's a little bit of schedule, but it's more in the how to make up the child's school day. It's important that this be listed in the IEP. Especially design instruction is also going to say, we're going to use special graph paper. We're going to use a special fidget toy. We're going to use a special grip on the pencil to make it easier to write. This is where any modifications, accommodations will be listed. Those are very individual to the child. It could be something like the child uses a specific chair. They use a weighted desk. They take a lot of sensory breaks. The child can go to the special ed classroom or the OT room with, maybe they have a one-on-one or a PCA that takes them to and from for their sensory needs. Or maybe they get pulled out during certain times, or they get pulled to the back of the room in a group. Or maybe they're outside in the hallway with a group and they're getting the instruction. This is where the specially designed instruction, it should say that. It should say when, where, and why, and what. And then if you don't understand the specially designed instruction, ask them, well, okay, who's going to implement this? So I had an IEP yesterday, and it was great. It was a great IEP. It was written right and had all these specially designed instructions, and it was amazing. And I said, well, okay, who's going to be giving that specially designed instruction? Because the teacher has 20 to 30 other kids. This student doesn't have an aide, doesn't have a PCA. I mean, you're saying this is going to be provided by the regular ed teacher. Well, when is that teacher going to be providing that? If we hadn't made time in that teacher's day to provide all this while at the same time teach the other kids. And so everyone was looking at each other like, oh, well, you can have the greatest thing written in the IEP, but you need to know who, what, when, and why, because you know, staff is limited. So how is that going to happen? How is it going to occur? So make sure it's written, especially design instructions in the IP, but more that the delivery is clear. Why is it important that the child learn it? How will they learn it? And then as we get back to the related services, when? Ese es el contenido de instrucción especialmente diseñada. Estaba compartiendo en inglés que ayer tuve una reunión para un estudiante. Estábamos viendo el plan y dije, bueno, este plan está increíble, está bien escrito, está todo claro, tiene un montón de cosas en instrucción especialmente diseñadas, perfectas para la necesidad del niño. Qué bueno que lo incluyeron. Los padres pues bien contentos, y yo les digo a todos, al equipo, ok, pues qué bien que lo escribieron, pero ¿quién es el que va a dar esa instrucción especialmente diseñada? Porque están diciendo que hay como 2 páginas de instrucción especialmente diseñada, pero este profesor tiene 20 a 30 alumnos y este estudiante no tiene ayudante. Entonces, ¿quién es el que va a estar dando toda esa instrucción? Si es que van a dar instrucción a los demás, ¿cuándo le vamos a dar esa instrucción? Entonces, estamos hablando de lo que se va a aprender, porque típicamente es diferente a lo de un alumno típico. La metodología, o sea, cómo vamos a aprender el currículo, qué currículo vamos a usar, cómo se va a aprender, en qué manera. ¿Será que se van a usar, como miran en esta foto, el niño está usando algo para ayudarlo en mantener el lápiz? A veces es un asiento especial, a veces es algo sensorial, a veces es breaks sensoriales para que puedan salir del aula para tomar un refresco, andar caminando y regresar. A veces que los van a sacar en grupo en la misma aula o afuera en los pasillos. A veces los van a llevar a otra aula. A veces es 1 a 1. ¿Cuándo los van a llevar? A veces están haciendo la instrucción de, digamos, literatura, y el niño no está a nivel de grado, pero lo mantienen ahí en esa aula. Y ahí es cuando hay problemas de conducta. Pues ni modo que hay problemas de conducta si el niño no está aprendiendo porque no está a su nivel. Entonces, ¿por qué no le damos el contenido, la instrucción especialmente diseñada, quizás un servicio relacionado a esa hora, para que el niño pues, se sienta a relacionar con lo que está aprendiendo? La entrega, porque es importante que el estudiante aprenda cómo lo van a dar, quién lo va a dar. Pueden tener una instrucción especialmente diseñada muy clara, y qué bueno que lo van a tener, pero quién lo va a dar y cómo lo van a dar. So this is how it all works together. So you can have specially designed instruction, universal design, explicit instruction, all the different teaching strategies, all the different related services, and it all gets put together with effective instruction. It could be more than one person doing this. It could be one teacher doing this. It could be taught to the whole class. It all kind of depends on the nature of the child's need and how the plan is designed. It all kind of falls together. If you're not understanding what any of this is, it's all usually in the IEP, and it's listed in there. So if you see words like universal design instruction, specially designed instruction, explicit instruction, effective teaching strategies, ask them, what are these? Or if you see something and you don't know what it is, ask them, what does this mean? And if they mention any of these things, it's instruction that they use when a child needs special education, or when a teacher is using different strategies to teach. It's all how we get students to learn. Estos son diferentes tipos de instrucción. A veces un profesor lo hace, a veces es una mezcla de profesor de educación especial y un profesor regular. A veces miramos estas frases en el IEP y no sabemos lo que quieren decir. Todo esto lo que quiere decir es que es diferentes tipos de manera de instrucción para que nuestros niños aprendan. Si lo miran en el IEP y no saben qué quiere decir, pregunten, ¿qué quiere decir eso? O no lo miran en el IEP y se quiere saber si están usando aprendizaje de diseño universal, pregunte, ¿ustedes usan aprendizaje de diseño universal? ¿Y cómo y cuándo? So placement is the last thing we're going to discuss. And placement means how are we going to teach? It's based on need, least restrictive environment. That means to the maximum extent, we have to try different things before we say, yep, can't do it in the regular ed. We're going to put them in a mixture of regular ed and special ed, or we're going to put them in special ed. They need to prove, the district needs to prove that they have done their best to provide all the supports and services in order for that child to learn in that environment and that it doesn't work. It also requires your signature in the prior written notice of recommended educational placement. It's called a no-rep or a PWN. It is a form that says the school district tried this, it didn't work. So now we're recommending this. Parent, do you agree? Do you not agree? Do you disagree? And then all your different procedural options. Placement is the last thing you talk about. You plan everything else. Placement is the last thing. A child's IEP category does not determine the classroom they're in. Just because a child has autism doesn't mean that they automatically are going to need autistic support. Just because they receive autistic support part of the day, that doesn't mean that they are there all day. Inclusion should always be tried. There is always a way to do inclusion. It just depends on the need of the child and how that looks. So again, placement is the last thing you talk about, and it doesn't depend on the categorization of the child. It's based on the need and proof that the district did all they could to keep that child included. I'm saying that because it's important. Our children do not live in a special box labeled by a different thing. They're going to be out in the community living just like you and I, with support and independence to the best of their abilities. And that starts in school. This is not just my personal belief. It is evidence-based. If you look at all the research, it shows that a child that is included not only helps the child with the disability, but it helps all kids. El plazo no es determinado al principio, es lo último que ustedes platican. Siempre tenemos que comprobar de que el distrito ha tratado de todas maneras de hacerlo en una manera menos restrictiva y que lo ha incluido. Recuerden que un niño no es según la etiqueta. Uno no debe de poner límites en el niño, y se ha comprobado que los niños que están incluidos tienen más éxito y ayudan también a los niños sin discapacidades, también niños típicos. A ambos niños se miran de que ha impactado la manera en que tratan de ser inclusión. La inclusión debe de ser intentado a lo máximo, porque nuestros niños no viven en un mundo con etiquetas y apartados, van a vivir como miembros de nuestra comunidad. También van a recibir un papel donde dice que usted está de acuerdo con el plazo, y si no está de acuerdo, hay diferentes opciones. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. I'm going to leave you with telling you that the most overwhelming key to a child's success is parents being involved. Studies show that the parents that are involved, in whatever manner you are capable of being involved, that those kids typically have success. And that includes kids with special education programming. And you become involved by knowing more about IEPs, knowing more about the laws, and knowing what to ask, and that it's okay to ask. In fact, I recommend that you go out your next IEP meeting and you go start asking questions, because don't just sit there and receive. Ask questions. Les quiero compartir esto y me despido con esto, que la clave para el éxito para todos nuestros niños es los padres que están involucrados en la educación de nuestros hijos. Se ha visto de que padres que están participando en los IEPs o en algo de la escuela, estos niños tienen más éxito. Vayan a la próxima junta del IEP, hagan preguntas y no salgan ahí sin quitarse las dudas y tener al menos una nueva respuesta. So go to the next IEP, and I challenge you guys to learn something new from that process and come out of it learning something new. Be more involved in the process. You are completely capable of it. So I wanted to thank everyone for your time. Don't forget, keep proof of everything. Mantenga comprobante de todo. And here is Uni's brief survey that I'm sure we will be sending via email as well. Thank you very much, guys. Thanks for your time. Gracias por su tiempo esta noche. Muchísimas gracias por estar conmigo. I hope this was useful. I hope that I'm challenging you to go out and do something at the next IEP. Ask a question, get something clear. If you always wanted to ask something, but you weren't sure what it was, go out and ask. There is no dumb question. The only dumb question is the one you don't ask. Trust me, because that usually is the case. La única pregunta que es tonta es la pregunta que uno no pregunta. Sálgase las dudas, vaya a hacer preguntas y les doy el desafío de que vayan a la próxima reunión y pregunten algo y aprendan algo nuevo. Thanks very much for joining me tonight.
Thank you so much, Lisbeth. This was really enlightening. This was a fabulous presentation just to get back to basics and go through it. And we really appreciate you doing it both in English and Spanish. So thank you.